studying these things. So get your Bibles out. Let's go over to Nehemiah chapter 11. Nehemiah chapter 11. We're going to be picking up here in just a moment. Before we get started, though, Ryan, would you lead us in the word of prayer?
Shall we pray? Father, then we take this opportunity we have on this Wednesday night to come together and study from your word in our classes. Pray as we approach the class tonight and look into the Bible, and examine our lives in light of your word. Consider to make sure we're abandoning all things. We pray as we look at Nehemiah particularly, that we learn the lessons we can from his life and the example he gave us of leadership. We pray for Brian that he might have a good remembrance of the lessons prepared. We also pray for people in Florida as they're going through the hurricane right now. We pray for your hand of help for the brethren there. We also pray for members that are away or traveling, that they might be able to come back to us safely. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. So Nehemiah chapter 11 picks up that the leaders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city. 9/10 were to dwell in other cities. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell in Jerusalem. So, when I kind of look at this, the idea of the leaders, the very first thing we read about is that the leaders of the people are the ones that dwell in Jerusalem. Well, first thing is, why the leaders? What's the significance of that? That's maybe not a hard one, but what's the significance of that? Leaders of the people are the ones in Jerusalem. Yeah. It's interesting, Stephen. Was it the center of power, say, a few decades before? Maybe not. It's kind of hard to say, but it was still the center of worship, but it certainly didn't have any power. The other cities that were around, and we might think of some of the cities on the coast, Gentile cities for sure, they certainly had a lot more power. But now Jerusalem is coming back. It is the place of power. So that's kind of a neat point. Anybody else have a comment? And
it's also for safety.
Oh yeah, why? Yeah.
Because these are the leaders, and if they knew the leaders were not there outside of the city, then they can go ahead and kill them real quick.
Yeah.
Get rid of the leaders, and then what do they have?
Yeah. No leaders. So it's interesting, Anthony, that we kind of can remember, like in the book of Chronicles, it talks about one of the first Persian governor was assassinated way back when. So, it is a dangerous thing to be out of that. So anything else to add? So then what we're looking at here, as we consider Nehemiah, he's telling us that now, first of all, the people, the leaders sit there, but who else is going to live there? Who else lives there? Not a hard question. What do you got, Ryan?
People who cast lots.
The people who cast lots. Now, Ryan, what I think is interesting, verse 2 says, the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell in Jerusalem. Ryan, what does that sound like?
Sounds like it wasn't a great thing.
Sounds like that doesn't sound like a great deal, It sounds like one of those things Brian says, I got a great opportunity for you, and you're thinking, I don't want to get a part of it. Why might this sound that way? I was really puzzled as I first read it, and I thought, you mean people aren't jumping at the opportunity to dwell in Jerusalem? Why? What's the issue here?
Well, because, before, people like the Romans came along with plumbing and sewage, living in a city wasn't a great experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point for us to consider, is that, it's interesting because, the Romans would bring an aqueduct to Jerusalem, but before that, they just had one really deep well that, Hezekiah's well, actually there's a couple of wells, but that's a really good point. Waste, not to get too far off of this, but I was reading a book once, and they were talking about that if you could go back in time and go to an ancient city, the thing that would hit you the most is how bad it's stayed. That would be the thing that you couldn't get over, that we just couldn't appreciate, is how bad a ancient city smelled. It just was just unbelievable because of these circumstances. Like Grant said, the Romans did improve that a lot, but that's another point. What else you got? What else do you think? I had a couple of wild hair ideas too. One of them might be, maybe a lot of Jews don't necessarily want to live that close to the priests. Why not? What do we find the people doing in chapter 13? Are they all living the way they should be living? No. And it's kind of like why people don't want to go on vacation with the preacher. Because, you're always a little nervous about what the preacher might say. Well, that's maybe some of that too. Is you're kind of nervous about living with the priest. That was my wild hair idea and thoughts. What else do you got? There's another idea. Oh, Stephen, go ahead.
I was just thinking that if someone is established, vineyards and
Yeah.
all the different things that they did outside the walls. Being inside the walls and remembrance to have them last time.
That's right. That's right. The last time people lived in the city walls were closed up, and it got so bad people were eating each other, kind of stuff. And that's not something that goes away in your mind. So that's a very true point. But let's actually explore too your point about the idea of people planting vineyards and stuff. I'm going to ask you a tough question, but you may know what I'm thinking. What kind of economy did this society run on? We live in what's called the information age, where information is everything. What was their society? Agriculture. So everything was about agriculture back then. You needed almost one for one. Today it's like one person can grow food for 100 people, but you really needed almost one person for one or two people for one to bring extra food. You needed food. That's how you made your money. That's how you made a living. And the idea of the inheritances of Israel was what? It was land. So the idea that I thought was probably the most likely scenario too is that to live in Jerusalem is to pass up on your land, to pass up on, having crops, making a living, maybe even making a profitable living, and living in the city. You're going to have to find something else to do. And like I said, for us, we kind of think today, oh yeah, I want to live in the city. That's where the jobs are. Well, that wasn't the case in ancient times. All the jobs were out of the city. And that's why people didn't like to live in cities. The only people that lived in cities were the people in control that were eating the food other people made. So to live in the city might mean for some people you have to change your profession, give up inheritance. So there might be a lot of burdens with that. We just don't think about it. Anybody else have a thought about that to throw out there? So the people are casting lots and they're blessing those that have moved in. The casting of lots is interesting. By the way, casting lots, somebody always asked it. What's always the tricky question about casting lots? People like to ask. Is it? Gambling, yes. It's tricky. Where else do we see casting lots that's like in the New Testament?
Acts 2, 1 and 2,
Yeah, Acts 1. What were they casting lots for?
to choose another apostle.
Yeah. That's a tricky one to say. I certainly wouldn't say it's gambling, but it seems an odd way to make an important choice. But frankly, whenever you're just not sure and you're praying about it, I think with the apostles, we're not sure which one, we're praying about it, that's the necessity of it.
And not just the Israelites that cast lots. We know that the Romans did when they were,
That's right.
and Jesus when he was given up.
Yeah, I forgot about that. They take his robe, so they didn't have to split it. I forgot all about that.
I was thinking that even today, coin toss is often regarded as an impartial way to decide.
Yeah. Chance. When we talk about the problems with gambling, it's not the chance. It's not the idea that you're making a choice randomly. It's the idea that you're taking something from someone that they didn't necessarily want to give you. Another lesson for another day, but I always think it's interesting when that question comes up from time to time. It's a great question without necessarily an easy answer. Lamar.
And just a reminder over in Proverbs 16, verse 33, it says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." So
Yeah.
there's a reminder that it's a way to appeal to God for a decision. Or
I didn't remember that passage, but it's a good sense that, and I always think of the apostles praying to God before they make that choice, picking people that fit the qualifications to the point where you just had, some selections that were pretty random. The other one I was thinking of too was back when they were trying to figure out who was causing Israel's problems, and they started casting lots, and they ended up finding Achan. Or when they were trying to figure out who had broken Saul's command, and they ended up finding Jonathan. So it's kind of interesting that in those cases, the Lord actually directed the circumstance too. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So rest of this chapter here, as you started reading through it, summarize it for me. Tell me what it is, verses 3 through 35. What are we looking at here? Help me out if I didn't want to read it and you were going to tell me, what am I looking at? What is all this?
it's kind of deciding or helping people decide where they're going to live. So certain 10% or so are going to be in Jerusalem, and the other 10% the other 90% are to inhabit the rest of the land.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is I'm not really sure if I understand entirely if they're trying to go back to their ancestors' allotments in so far as the passing out of things. In the New Testament, there's one reference in particular to a guy going back to his ancestral allotment. Who was that? He goes back to his ancestral allotment in Bethlehem. Joseph, very good. Joseph goes back to, whenever he's called for the census. So there's some connection, but I don't know exactly if they're working towards that or not. So that's a really good question that I'm not sure what they're doing here. So they're trying to decide who's going where, not just in Jerusalem, but all the different villages that they are going back into. Mostly Judah, but who else? Judah and Benjamin. And by the way, this is kind of important because when we're in the New Testament times, what are the three tribes that are left that we talk about? Judah, Benjamin, who's the third? Levites, very good. By the way, I say that's not 100% true. We have one person who's kind of the oddball, that she's from the tribe of Asher. That's Anna. But other than that, that's the only other tribes that are mentioned. Those are the three tribes that are mentioned that are kind of amalgamated in the New Testament as the people called the Jews.
I was curious because I was noticing that Simeon seems to be, almost central to Judah.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they have been considered?
So Stephen, that's an interesting question. If you guys look at a map, you have a map in the back of your Bible, you can flip there and look at it. When you look at Judah, when the tribes are broken up, where does Simeon always appear, Stephen? Right in the middle, right in the middle. Now, by the way, these maps are kind of, we're trying to kind of peg cities and stuff, so it's always got to be careful to say they might not represent exactly what it's like, but Simeon is set right in the middle of Judah. Now, I'd love to go into this a little further. Back in the book of Judges, whenever Simeon was supposed to get their land, let me make sure I got this right. Simeon's supposed to get their land. What did they do? You remember? In Judges 1, verse 3, 4, 5, I can't remember where. They said, hey, Judah, come help us get our inheritance. Now, I've always wondered if that was contrary to what God had said to do, because he wanted each tribe to get it. And the interesting thing is that Simeon's land ends up in the middle of what then later Judah takes around it. Now, by the time of the kings like David and such, you're not hearing about that tribe of Simeon. So I'll tell you, I guess what I think happened. I think they kind of got drawn into Judah. So, by the way, Stephen, if that's the case, then we might say Judah was still around in a way, but we don't really read about Simeonites after, say, the time of David or Solomon or the kings like that. So it's kind of interesting that they would be a part of that in a sense, but you don't hear about them. Like I said, I'd be speculating to say it's directly connected to what you read in Judges 1, but it's a great question. And the answer, my guess is they are drawn in. Anyone else? So, as we go on here and we talk about these things, I'm going to say that Lamar kind of answered this for us. Why might this list be included in the text? What are we kind of setting up here? Lamar kind of told us a little bit about this. He said, well, we're passing it out. Why might this be something that has to be recorded? I've told you I have a theory that I think the book of Nehemiah, as an inspired book, is also kind of a report to maybe Artaxerxes or somebody else, because I like the way it's written. Sometimes I feel like it's written like it's a report with chapter 13 as an addendum to it. But it's kind of written in that way. Well, if this was a quasi-official thing too, why might this be important? What might be important about this breaking up the lands and going to families? What do you think? Well, this might be something that the government, the rulers, would then say, well, this is now your allotment. This is now your family's allotment. Now, tell me this. Do people ever get in fights about property? Yeah, of course. I remember years ago on our farm that I grew up on, one day a surveyor came out and surveyed the corner of my father's farm right off to the neighbor. And that was the corner where the well was. So my father was in a terrible panic. Our neighbor was a really nice guy. He said, well, we'll just leave it and I'll deed it over to you. That was a really nice way to handle it. But the idea is there's going to be a lot of land controversies. And in fact, a lot of ancient documents, probably a huge number of ancient documents are land disputes. Well, this is kind of setting it up right away to say, this is how the land is being dispersed. So it's going to set us up for centuries as to who belongs where. And so it's a useful thing. Anybody else have any other thoughts about that?
Must have been a problem because there was a penalty for moving the landmark.
Yeah. What was it?
You tell me.
That's what I was hoping to say. I didn't ask that rhetorically. I know that we have proverbs that say, do not move the ancient landmark. I'll give somebody a brine point if you can tell me what the law said, but this was a big deal. Moving landmarks is a big deal. By the way, it's still a big deal. Moving survey markers are still a big deal. So it was a big deal. And as I said, I would think of the proverb that says, do not move the ancient boundary.
It would have been important too when the year of Jubilee came around, because the lands went back to the original.
That's right. And again, my bigger question was always, well, were these families descended from the original owners? And I don't know that we know. So I can't help but to think that we're reestablishing a lot of those things. So as you said, something like the year of Jubilee, which you're right to say is a really important idea, you would have to have some kind of established document that said who had what. Tacho?
So I guess to them, genealogy was really important.
Yeah, boy, these chapters tell us that. And again, I don't think we can spend too much time on saying that that's a big deal. Because if you can't prove your genealogy, what? You can't prove.
You were out.
You're out. You're not an heir of Israel. You're not an heir of the promises. That genealogy is all that matters. Now, by the way, I was thinking about this earlier, Tacho, because I thought, why is there so much emphasis on genealogy in Nehemiah or all through the Old Testament? The answer is because your promises lie in your genealogy. How is that true in Christ? Where's your inheritance? In Him and your adoption by grace. So, having the name of Christ, that's where our adoption, that's where our inheritance lies. So it's still all about genealogy, just the spiritual genealogy for us today. We're the children of God, and that's the only reason we have the hope of eternal life is that promise. So the genealogy matters, and you want to do everything you can to keep it. So that's a big deal. Anybody else have something to throw? So as we pick up here, going through the end of the chapter, we pick up some of the language about the preparations on dedicating the wall and gatekeepers and the work that we saw there. What were some of those preparations? Anthony?
I was gonna say it's is that the verse for about the landmarks is in
Would you read it for us?
Deuteronomy 27. Cursed on verse 17. Cursed is he who moves his neighbor's boundary mark, and all the people should say amen.
So it was a curse. I actually was thinking it might have been a executable offense, but cursed, that's interesting. Is that in the blessings and curses too? Is that what that is?
It's verse Deuteronomy 27.
Well, I don't think it is. Actually, that's too early.
So no, yeah, chapter 2 early.
Yeah, but it is interesting that it establishes that it's a curse. Wall preparations. What are we going to do to prepare this wall? I kind of hinted at it already, but it's nice to have something built really nice, but what do you have to have once you have something nice, Tacho?
Don't you have a watchman?
Well, you got to have watchmen. Good. So one of the things we're going to be setting up, I'm going to find the passage for the watchmen. One of the things we're going to be setting up are the people that are I just lost gatekeepers. Verse 19, the gatekeepers. And the keeper of the gates, 172 men have to be put in charge of that. What else? Somebody's coming through the gates. What are you going to do?
Opener? Gate opener?
Okay, so, and the gatekeepers might open it, but you also have to have people in charge of money and collecting things. And, I think of some of the language that talks about how they're going to be put in charge of different aspects of there's a statement that says everything outside of the city, or outside of the house of God has to be measured too. And we'll see some importance of that in chapter 13. What else? What are some of the other preparations that have to be set up? What else do you see? Go ahead, Dee.
And 9, cleaning the roofs and bringing back the articles of the house of God.
So, one of the things that they need to do is make sure that everything is set up. And Dee, that kind of leads us into this next part of the question when we're looking at chapter 11 and verse 1 and chapter 11 verse 18, where the Levites in the city, where'd all the Levites go? Weren't they going to all be in the city? Where did the Levites end up? Where are they supposed to go?
City.
Cities. Which city?
Well, Of refuge.
The cities of refuge, which, by the way, I don't know if the cities of refuge outside of Judah, which there were what, two? If the cities of refuge outside of their three would have been considered any longer because they weren't connected to them. But the Levites are supposed to be out and about. The Levites are supposed to be out in these other places. And what are the Levites supposed to be doing? If it's not their time to serve at the temple, what are they doing? Well, they're supposed to be teaching the people. Good. What else, Tasha?
Sacrifices? No.
Sacrificing. Well, the priests are working those sacrifices at the temple. They're also supposed to be growing their own food and maintaining their own farms and such. So there's a sense where that was also a part of the work that they were doing. So that's an important point. Anybody else have something on chapter 11? If not, let's go ahead and pick up chapter 12. Go ahead and pick up at chapter 12. So chapter 12 starts us off here. Again, talking about the priests. And it's interesting that it goes all the way back to the priests that had come with Zerubbabel and Joshua. Now, by the way, I'm going to want to dig around a little bit with some of these people and how it is that they're, the different priests that are doing things and who's responsible. It's interesting to me. Let me read verse 22. During the reign of Darius the Persian, a record was also kept of the Levites and priests who had been heads of their fathers' houses in the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua, the sons of Levi, the heads of the fathers' houses until the days of Johanan, the son of Eliashib, were written in the book of Chronicles. Now, that's something I think is kind of important for us to be thinking about. We're going to come back to those names here in a moment because those names are important. Eliashib, well, tell me this. I'll ask the question early. Who is Eliashib? Who is Eliashib? We met him back in chapter 3, and we kind of met him indirectly. Who was he? Yeah, so he was the high priest. He's actually the grandson, what we're reading here, he's actually the grandson of Joshua, the great high priest. Now, Joshua is a phenomenal high priest. At least I get the impression from like what Zechariah said and such. What kind of high priest is Eliashib? No, not so good. And we're going to talk about this in chapter 13, why that is. But Eliashib's grandfather Joshua, great high priest, Eliashib, not so much. Let's talk about this ceremony that he brings through. Beginning at verse 31 of chapter 12. I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall, appointed 2 large thanksgiving choirs, one to the right hand of the wall toward the refuse gate, after them with Hoshea, and half the leaders of Judah, Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, with some of the priest's sons with trumpets, Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, son of Zachor, the son of Asaph, and his brethren, Shemaiah, Azarel, Delilah, Mai, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them. I'm going to give a pause here. What's the big thing that's the celebration here? What's the celebration? How would you describe this? You're watching this. You just read this, but you're watching it. What does it look like?
I was really surprised when I was reading this, but apparently this is a huge procession on the wall.
Yeah.
Apparently this wall is about 9 feet wide. So they had people walking in different directions all the way around 4 miles around the wall of the city.
I was thinking like they were, going away from each other, kind of is the idea where it says, verse 38, the Thanksgiving choir the other direction. Who's in front?
That's right.
With who is in front with it? This term, the Thanksgiving choir, is mentioned in both cases. The idea of the Thanksgiving choirs that are leading off. What might that look like? By the way, we think of choir. It's not. This isn't a cappella, right? And we'll talk about that here in just a second. But what is this? I think of like a parade. And what's always in the front of the parade? Like a marching band or something like that. Let's talk just for a second about what that music would be like. Is it a surprise to anyone that there are musical instruments, trumpets, and such? Why not?
They were used before.
Yeah, they've been used before. Who who established these according to what we just read? David established some of these. Go ahead. Yeah, David established some of these things. Now, were they actually all established by David? Well, way back when the giving of the law, Moses commissioned some of the trumpets that they were to build and such. What did David do? Does anybody know? Kind of a little more complicated. What did David do to music in worship?
Didn't he set up a chorus?
He set up. So what he did is he set up singers and he set up songwriters as their own commissioned group. Singers and songwriters, people that were just charged with writing songs. By the way, anybody know who the big group was that wrote the most songs? You read them a lot. The sons of son of Asaph. Yeah, very good. So so we know a lot of those are psalms that were inspired by God. Well, that's established by David, and David commissioned these music makers and these people that used stringed instruments. So usually uses the word lyre, but it wouldn't look like the harps that we think of today. But they had these musical instruments. And these all go all the way back to back in the Old Testament, all the way back to Moses. Now, what do you say when somebody comes along to you and says, "Hey, look, musical instruments. What's wrong with you people? You never use them." What do we point out here? What do we try to remind people when somebody looks at this and says, "Hey, musical instruments, these are pleasing to God"? What do we say to them, Teresa?
Well, they weren't authorized in the New Testament.
That's right, but they were authorized in the Old Testament. So number one, Old Testament, New Testament, we're talking about two different authorities. What else do we go? What do we kind of point out about Old Testament worship in general? What kind of worship was it? It had like the temple and it had the priests. And the priests had the fancy garments.
Well, weren't these
Very
just?
physical.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's Linda, that's it. It's all physical. Let's use the word carnal because it just, it's carnal, physical. Everything that they did in their worship was physical. The Jerusalem they worshiped at, physical place, gets burned down. The temple that they offered their sacrifices in, it was a physical temple, got destroyed. The altars that they used were physical altars. So they were carnal, man-made altars, man-made instruments, man-made candelabras, not candelabra, the candle stand. All those things were man-made physical. It makes sense that the music was also man-made physical. Now, you contrast that to the New Testament. Tom, I'll go ahead and throw your comment out there before we.
Well, I'm just thinking that as I recall, this was just by family. There was a family of musicians, is that correct? And a family of singers? Or were they sons of that?
We had Korah and Asaph. So I don't remember that Korah and Asaph are related. There might be more than one family that was doing it. What do you think?
Somewhere I recall, and I can't pull it up, that there was just the sign, these are those playing instruments. First, we understand the fact that in the New Testament, all of them were not playing instruments.
That's true.
Just certain individuals were playing instruments. And of course, under the New Testament, all.
That's a great point. That's a great observation. The difference between some and all and what they did, that's good. Let's kind of contrast, though, for a moment, this Old Testament worship and New Testament worship. Old Testament has a physical temple. What do we have? A spiritual temple. What is the spiritual temple? Church, body. What's the spiritual altar? The Bible talks about our heart being an altar. What's the spiritual garment that we wear? What's the spiritual priesthood?
Christ,
us.
the spiritual garment.
Christ is the spiritual garment. Where do we put on Christ? In baptism. So if we're making spiritual sacrifices as a spiritual priesthood in a spiritual temple with spiritual altar, wouldn't it make sense we'd have spiritual music? Well, what is spiritual music? Yes, that's the answer. Spiritual music is music from the heart. So when we sing, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16 says, where are we making music? We're making melody in your heart. Jesus said, your mouth, what's the connection of your mouth and your heart?
Comes out of your mouth, comes from the heart.
Yes, what proceeds from the mouth comes from the heart. So it actually makes complete sense that they would be using physical, mechanical, musical instruments then to contrast with the spiritual instrument we're playing today, our heart, and the sacrifice of the fruit of our lips. because everything else we're offering God is spiritual. So it makes sense that the music too changed in that time.
I think even looking back at this, you can see that the focus of what they're doing, as you read through this, chapter over and over again, he talks about how important it is that they're singing and giving thanks to God.
Yeah.
And the instruments are almost a, afterthought to that the important thing, even here in the Old Testament, is the giving thanks to God.
Yeah, isn't that neat? That's very interesting about the idea. And that's, again, our passages like Colossians 3:16 or Ephesians 5:19 talk about, singing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, giving thanks to God. Now, I've run our time a lot longer than I should have on this. I just think it's so neat, though, that in the walls being established, music is such a big part of this. And the leaders of Israel are all behind this. And I love that there's a lot of times in Israel's history where they were even led to battle by musicians. That's crazy. But I think it's such a neat thing that we lead ourselves into battle with music, that we're bringing forth these songs and these things. And I wish I could spend more time on this, but I got to get to chapter 13. So I'm going to skip the rest of the questions here. We're going to jump up to chapter 13. Chapter 13, let's start off by establishing an idea. Chapter 13 takes place a long time later. We kind of get a sense of this up in verse 13 and verse 6, where the things that we start reading about are kind of qualified in verse 6, that he says, during all of this, assumably the events from verse 1 on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. Now, do you remember that the king, whenever he sent Nehemiah, what he told Nehemiah?
Want him to come back.
Yeah, you got to come back. You got to come back. I'll send you, but you got to come back. So he's going to spend a total, we see it here in chapter 5 and verse 14, a total of 12 years as the governor, and then he's going to return. Now, trick question. How long was he gone before he came back? Maybe not a trick question, just say. We don't know. He doesn't say. I assume it's years. One interesting thing is that Artaxerxes would go on to reign for another, so it goes on to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes. I think Artaxerxes reigns for 46 years. So I would assume as much as 14 years within that time that Nehemiah might be gone. And Nehemiah now comes back. And when he comes back, chapter 13 begins that they start reading the book of Moses. And what do they find out about the book of Moses saying about Ammonites and Moabites?
We're allowed to enter.
They're not allowed to enter. Now, by the way, here's a tough question, were they Canaanites that were supposed to be destroyed? No, Stephen's right, they weren't. Remember, the Ammonites and Moabites are brother nations, descended from Lot, and God had given them their own inheritance. But they had done something that angered God. What had they done?
They wouldn't let them pass through their country when they were.
Number one, they wouldn't let them pass through their country. Number two, when they decided they didn't like the Israelites in this big country, who did they hire? Yeah, they hired Balaam. Balak, the king, hired Balaam. So important for us to understand that these are nations that weren't under the curse of the Canaanite nations. That's way back in Ezra. We read about them intermarrying with the nations that have been cursed. But now we're reading about these two nations and their place there. And so when Israel is reading the law, they realize we've got a problem. Well, tell me this. Let me jump ahead for just a second. What's the problem that they have, that they realize they have? What's going on? It has to do with that guy Elisha I mentioned a moment ago. Elisha was doing what?
Bringing out
He is renting out rooms where the things of God, the house of God, the storerooms of the house of God, he is renting them to Tobiah the Ammonite. Tobiah the Ammonite. Now, I want you to think about how big a deal this is. Remember years before Nehemiah they were trying to get Nehemiah to run and hide in the temple. What did Nehemiah say? Won't do it. We said maybe that's because he might have been a eunuch and not allowed to enter in. Tobiah is definitely not allowed to enter in. So how does Nehemiah feel about Tobiah getting rooms rented to him? What did it say here about this whenever he found out about it? Verse 8. What's it say? grieved him bitterly. So here it was, while he was governor, he had set this example. I'm not even going to go in the temple because, I'm not supposed to. Really, the priests are supposed to. He kept this sanctified idea. He comes back, and the priests are renting rooms to Ammonites. Now, well, that's bad. But these are rooms that what's supposed to be there? Well, the tithes for the priests. So where are those? And the answer is, oh, yeah, that's it. Oh, they're not there. And so this guy is, his goods, it describes the idea of the things that he has. It just talks about his household goods and such, whether, the idea of it's just his home or it's, also his place of business, whatever it is. This guy moved into this building, probably the nicest building in Jerusalem, renting a room. And it's at the, and like I said, the priests are making this money. Now, by the way, it's not clear if Eliashib is still around because it wants us to connect here, Eliashib, the idea that Eliashib had set this up, but that Eliashib's sons, his children, are now the ones that are acting as priests. So it'll identify his son, Johanan, a little later on as the man that's the high priest at this point. But the idea is that their father had set this arrangement up. It's probably been going on for a while. Didn't you have a problem? Oh. So we have this arrangement going on, and so we know that Tobiah has been a big problem maker for a long time. He's been a big enemy of Nehemiah. Nehemiah comes back, and Tobiah is living in the temple. Just disgusting and angering to him. Now, what did Nehemiah do whenever he saw all this? Yeah, he threw it all out. Now, by the way, remind me, Tobiah was what? What was his position? He was a fellow governor. He was the governor of the Ammonites. He may not have been governor anymore, but he had been. So one of the questions that came up is, well, could that get Nehemiah in trouble? Well, of course it could. Of course it could get him in trouble. But the point is, what they were doing was wrong. So Nehemiah goes on to say in verse 11, why is the house of God forsaken? I gathered them together, set them in their place, and Judah brought the tithe of grain and new wine and oil to the storehouse. Now, by the way, we talk about that word tithe. Remind me, what is a tithe? It's a tenth. That's what the word tithe means. And we tithe today, right? No, it's not in the New Testament. Why not? Anthony, why don't we give a tenth?
Well, it's not, we give as we are possible.
Yes, in the New Testament, giving is not a tenth. Giving is 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Giving is as we desire, as we prosper, as we want to give.
And in the Old Testament, tithe was like grain offering.
Yes.
It wasn't money.
Yes, tithing was 1/10 of what you harvest, 1/10 of what your livestock was. You brought those things, and what was that tithe for? Yes. So does that kind of help us understand why it might have been 1/10? Because if every tribe kicks in 1/10, then theoretically, what should you have?
They should have a full.
They should have a full supply. And by the way, we're running out of tribes at this point, but we're still seeing that as being the idea. So why did God make it a 10? Well, that's logistical. That you then have a pretty good sense with a little bit extra. Now, by the way, I bet they never had extra. Because people were probably on the short side of this, and they were here, and many other times too. But the idea is that Old Testament tithe was set up for the purpose of a logistical way to ensure the Levites were taken care of. There's no mention of the tithe in the New Testament. Christians don't tithe, but we each give as we desire to give, reflecting on both our spiritual maturity, our prosperity, and our desire to participate in that. We're always very clear to say that. We always say things like, if you're visiting, we're not asking of you, and we always say things like, it doesn't matter how much you give. There's no measurement that needs to be followed. So that's an important thing to think of. Anybody have anything to follow up with that? So then, to understand this idea, let's consider, let me jump out of this for just a second. And actually, let's skip this question. And let's go all the way up to verse 23 now. So in verse 23, the Levites need to get themselves cleansed in verse 22, and we're trying to prepare that. But now in verse 23, Nehemiah also has a problem in those days when he comes back. What's the problem? What's the sin that the people have committed now?
Intermarrying.
Intermarrying. Now, here's what's interesting. When we talked about this before, in the time of Ezra, that's roughly pretty close to this time period. So what we had in Ezra was the people had to put away all these foreign spouses. And now we've got it again. Now we've kind of gone right back to it. Now, kind of interesting in this case, because he'll say they've married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Now, those are a little different. Those nations are mentioned, but there were more nations in the book when it happened with Ezra. What was the result? What was going on after this? What were their kids running around doing?
They didn't even know the language.
Yeah, speaking what language? The language of Ashdod. That's a neat expression that sometimes we use to say when somebody has become worldly, that they speak the language of Ashdod. Ashdod is kind of symbolic for the world around us. And, sometimes people, get along with the world so much that they talk just like worldly people. They think like worldly people. So their children are now speaking the language of Ashdod. It's kind of interesting. Whenever Nehemiah, well, let me say this. What's the big hazard? He kind of goes back into their history to say, don't you remember all the things that have happened to us? Verse 26, don't you remember Solomon? What's the danger?
Idolatry.
Idolatry. That when you married with people that didn't have your value, they tended to draw away. Now, I want to be kind of careful here. There's a pretty famous Moabite that was married that not only wasn't put away, but became an important person. Who is that? Ruth. Very good. Ruth was a Moabite. And by the way, that's always a puzzle because it says a Moabite couldn't enter into the assembly of the Lord up to the 10th generation. Ruth's great-grandson was David. So that's always kind of a puzzle. But it also suggests to us that if somebody committed themselves to the law of Moses, converted, and we don't just have her, we also have who else? Rahab. Oh, Naomi. Naomi actually was a Jew. She was actually from Bethlehem. So that's a good. But we also have people that were, other people were brought in as well, Tamar. But the point is that when people came in and converted, so we're saying these aren't people that converted. These were people that kept their own beliefs that were causing the problem. What I think is interesting is when Ezra dealt with this situation, it says Ezra went out and wept and he tore his robes and he plucked at his beard. David and I, we'll tell you, don't pluck at a beard. That's not a pleasant thing. And he plucked at his beard. But what did Nehemiah do? I think it's kind of funny. What did Nehemiah do? Ezra plucked at his beard. Nehemiah?
He contended with them.
Yeah, he plucked at their beard. It's kind of an interesting thing. I wish I had noticed what he did. He said, I contended with them. I cursed them. I struck some of them. I pulled out their hair. Wow. I tell you what, Nehemiah is probably not a young guy anymore. And he's out there, and can you see him? I don't know how old he is. Maybe he's a guy with a walking cane, and he's, hitting him around. He's grabbing at him, and he's yelling at him. He's angry. And why not be? They just dealt with this problem a few years before. And how did that end for everybody? How did everybody go out of that?
You would think that they wouldn't have done it again because they knew what happened before. They had to separate families.
And how did the people take that?
Not what?
It says they were all crying. What a day. Something I don't think you forget. And now they've done it again. This is kind of different than human nature, right? That we do something wrong, we suffer for it. Normally, we never go back to it, right? That's my face. We do it all the time. It's incredible that humans are this way, that we'll do something, we'll suffer badly. Oh, I'll never do that again. It's me and Taco Bell. That's the relationship I have with Taco Bell. Never do this again next night. Taco Bell sounds good. And that's how sin is. Stephen?
This chapter seems to me to be really disappointing and discouraging to Nehemiah because everything he has done, every fiber of his being is trying to get these people to do exactly what they're supposed to do, and it's all crumbled. And he sees where it's headed, and I wonder if Malachi 2:2
Oh, yes,
is
yeah.
describing exactly what they were doing, the priest in particular.
So, Stephen, I'm at my time, which really is terrible because I really wanted to close up with exactly what you just said. Nehemiah ends sad. Nehemiah ends priests are making a mess of things, and oh my goodness, one of them's married to Sanballat's family, and they're not sanctifying themselves, and the people are marrying, and look at all these problems. I'm trying to cleanse them, verse 30, cleanse them of everything pagan and such, and that's kind of how it ends. And you think, oh man, this is bad. But you know, the ending of Nehemiah really isn't here. The ending of Nehemiah is the book of Malachi. And the very last thing in the book of Malachi is that someone was coming that was going to straighten all of this out. Now, by the way, it's kind of a tricky question. Who is that? It's not Jesus. John the Baptist, that Levite of Levites, greatest prophet ever, is going to come and straighten everything out. We're going to stop there. Wish I had a little more time, but we don't. Thanks so much. Great opportunity, great study. Next week, you've got a couple of things to read. You'll look at, I think it's John 17 and 1 John 4 in preparation for class. You've got some questions you can look at there and be ready with some answers. Thanks so much for your participation.